Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Pittsburgh Sports Memories podcast, where you don't listen to the podcast listens to you. I'm your host, Tim Hannon. With me,
Ooh.
as always,
I'm Comrade Steve Word, and we are humbly pushing back the communists, or not the communists, the capitalists. Yes, we're taking the wealth from the evil capitalists and giving it to the wonderful workers of the world, at least hockey-wise.
so yes, this episode is going to deal with an interesting story, one that I don't think a lot of people probably know about, and it's about the time that the Pittsburgh Penguins bought the Soviet Red Army hockey team and tried to run it and tried to integrate with it, and kind of a lot of shenanigans happen as a result. So before we get started, I have to give a lot of props here to a documentary by a guy named Gabe Polsky entitled Red Penguins. And that documentary is really where I got so much of the information for this show. Really well done documentary, really tells the story of this in depth. So go out and watch that if you're interested in learning more. I think I watched it on Hulu, but you can probably find it, wherever it's streaming or where you can purchase it. So to set the context for all this, the first thing we really have to talk about is the Cold War. And boy, I'm not sure how I can sum up the entire Cold War in a few paragraphs, but here goes. So after World War II, in which the United States and the Soviets were allies, the Soviet Union kind of goes full supervillain under Joseph Stalin. And for the next 40 years, the United States and the USSR are at war with each other without physically being at war with each other, if that makes sense. And that's where the term Cold War comes from. Both countries were building up a stockpile of nuclear weapons, and both countries had those nuclear weapons pointed at each other, ready to set off at any moment. Citizens of both countries lived in constant fear of nuclear attack, and kids in both countries grew up hating the other country. And Steve and I grew up in the 1980s, and Steve, our experience with communism and the USSR was probably a little different than the kids that grew up in the 50s and 60s. But the tension was still high at that point, and I don't know what was your view of the Soviet Union when you were a kid?
When I was a kid, well, that's probably like tainted by the fact that like my father like had me watch like Red Dawn. Anyway, the bunch of kids go into the mountains and hold off the communists because because not the guy, but the Soviet Union, because they decided to start a war with the United States for no good reason apparently. But yeah, it was just like more of fear. I remember like when I was a little kid, like you just thought like at any moment there could be a war and like anything could set it off, and you just were never quite sure like what was going to set it off. But it definitely was an interesting situation for sure, and it definitely ended when the Americans got the Red October submarine and with the Caterpillar drive. And oh no, that didn't actually happen.
No, it actually ended when Rocky Balboa knocked
Admiral
out Ivan
Remus.
Drago.
Yeah.
That's actually when it ended.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, and he said, if I can change, you can change. We can all change.
That's right.
That's when it ended. I forgot about that. That, or maybe when the Russians lost in Afghanistan. Yeah, and had their own little Vietnam. But topic for another podcast. Yeah,
minor, happenstance compared to Rocky IV and Red October, Hunt for Red October. But yeah, you mentioned movies. I mean, that was a big part of the culture for years. Any movie was always us versus them, kind of, call it propaganda if you want, but that was definitely the storyline. And I would say a big part of the Cold War, it wasn't just who could obliterate the other, it was also who was the best. That was really encompassed in the space race. The Russians were the first to send a man into space, which was a huge deal. and then the Americans were the first to put a man on the moon. So there was always a competition between these two systems of government, kind of which was better, and it was all about proving that to not only their own countries but the rest of the world. And I think sports, and in particular hockey, definitely plays a big role in that competition. The Soviet national hockey team was dominant. Between 1954 and 1991, they won nearly every world championship and Olympic tournament that they competed in, and they never failed to medal in any international ice hockey federation tournament that they were in. Their only real blip on the radar was the 1980 Winter Olympics, the Miracle on Ice game. And if you don't understand why that's commonly referred to as the greatest moment in sports history, it's because not only was it set against this whole Cold War backdrop that we just talked about, but also that Soviet hockey team never lost. I mean, they were literally unbeatable. And the idea that an American team, I mean, not Canada or some other country that actually was good at hockey, right? But an American team being the ones to upset them in Lake Placid, it was just too unbelievable to actually be true. And that's why they've made movies about that. It's so legendary because it's the greatest upset in the history of sports.
Oh, for sure. Like, and two, like this didn't earlier that year they had beaten the Rangers, like the New York Rangers, like by like 5 goals, like a professional, and they almost beat the Canada team in what the Summit Series in the 70s, and they only lost because that who's that piece of garbage who played for the Flyers? Bobby Clark broke Valery Varlamov's ankle in a cheap shot. So,
yeah, we'll get into that, actually.
Yeah. So there I am standing up for the commies. Commie. But no, that was kind of BS.
So the Soviet hockey team is dominant at the national level, and the best team in the USSR was a team called CSKA Moscow, which was commonly referred to as the Central Red Army team. And the reason they were referred to as the Red Army team was because they were actually a functioning division of the Soviet Army. And, back then in the Soviet Union, all able-bodied Soviet males were required to serve in the military. And so the team was able to just literally draft the best young hockey players in the Soviet Union onto the team because they had to come into the military. They were part of the military, and then whoever was the most talented athletes they would go on to the CSKA Moscow team. And there was a ton of overlap between the rosters of the Red Army team and the Soviet national team, which is why both were so dominant. And Steve, we thought it was impressive when the Penguins won back-to-back Stanley Cups a few years ago. In the 1970s and the 1980s, the Red Army team wins 13 consecutive league championships. 13. And you might say, okay, well, the competition couldn't have been that good, right? They're playing in Russia, in a Russian league against other Russian teams. How good could the competition really be? Well, between 1976 and 1991, the Red Army team played a bunch of these super series. Steve, you referenced that earlier with the national team. The Red Army team played a bunch of these super series against NHL teams. So CSKA Moscow, the Red Army team, would travel to North America to play NHL teams on their home ice. And the Red Army team never lost one of these series. In 1986, they played the Edmonton Oilers in Edmonton. This is the Wayne Gretzky Edmonton Oilers that were in the middle of winning 5 Stanley Cups. And they just wiped the floor with them in Edmonton. And then Steve referenced this earlier. Sometimes those got ugly. The Flyers throwing the elbow. When that happened, Steve, the Soviets actually all skated off the ice in protest.
Yeah, they didn't come out for the third period of that game. Yeah, the Summit Series, Canada did win. I don't even know the name of the guy from Canada. Like, he's a very minor player who ended up scoring, but that was more in the 70s and the 80s. But that's probably one of the greatest hockey teams of all time in hockey. I mean, it's pretty hard to argue.
Yeah, it is hard to argue. And that Red Army team may have been the greatest hockey team of all time. Here's some guys that played for that team that you may have heard of and who are also in the Pro Hockey Hall of Fame. Pavel Bure, Sergei Fedorov, Slava Fetisov, Igor Larionov, Sergei Zubov, who later played for the Penguins, and Vladislav Tretiak, who was the goaltender on that 1980 team. And actually, a lot of people believe that the only reason the Soviets lost that game is because they pulled Tretiak out. I
Yeah.
think it was after the first period.
Tikhonov. Yeah, he gave up a weak goal at the end of the period to I forget it wasn't Eruzione, it was the first goal, and like Tikhonov got mad and pulled him, and like it's like you took the best goalie out because he gave up like kind of a weak goal. But
I think the American players
didn't
even
seem to
said
hold.
if Tretiak would have stayed in, we wouldn't have won. Like I think the American players are actually quoted saying that.
Yeah.
So he was very good. Steve, you mentioned Viktor Tikhonov. So Viktor Tikhonov was the Red Army team's coach, and he was also the coach of the Soviet national team. He had held both of those positions since 1977. And Tikhonov was your classic like hardline Soviet. He was known for kind of a dictator coaching style. He had just total control over his players' lives because remember, this is the Red Army team. And Tikhonov was a colonel in the army, and so this was very similar to basic training going into the army. I mean, this wasn't guys could go out and go to the clubs at night. I mean, they were in barracks and they practiced 10 to 11 months during the year. And after 13 championships in a row and all this dominance against North American teams, by the 1990s, Tikhonov is a legendary figure in Russia. I'd say the best comparison is probably Vince Lombardi, where people in America, even if they're not really football fans, they know the name Vince Lombardi, and they say that that's basically what it was in Russia with Tikhonov. Everybody knew who Viktor Tikhonov was. So around the late 1980s, things start to shift a little bit in the hockey scene in Russia. Defections begin. Some Russian players were finally leaving for the NHL. Some, with permission. I think most probably without permission. Alexander Mogilny was drafted by the Buffalo Sabres in 1988, and he defects. And then really the Detroit Red Wings, they're the ones that really sink the Red Army team because they pillage a bunch of players on that team and eventually build a dynasty with them. If you noticed that list we read earlier of Hall of Famers, if you were listening, there were several Red Wings on there like Fedorov and Larionov and company that all went on to play for the Red Wings and have a ton of success. There's also a documentary by that same guy I mentioned earlier, Gabe Polsky, about the Russian Five and that whole transition, which is also a good documentary. So Russian hockey players are starting to leave the Soviet Union. That's a problem. However, late 80s, early 90s, country has a bigger problem on its hands. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, and there's a lot of reasons and events that took place causing that to happen. Way too much to get into on a sports podcast. But we'll just say that the end result is that what was once the USSR becomes 15 independent nations, the largest of which is Russia. A guy named Boris Yeltsin takes over as president of Russia. U.S. President George Bush declares the Cold War over, says America has won, and the Soviet Union is no more. And Steve, I remember being so shocked by that.
Nobody saw it coming. That's the craziest part is like there was like no warning or anything. It just like kind of one day it was like, we're out. See ya. We're done. We can't do this no more. It was just weird. Like maybe because in 1989, I wasn't like old enough to really know. Plus you figure like it wasn't like now where like you could read like more independent news sources. So like it was probably harder to understand really what was going on.
It was just weird to not have a Soviet Union anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, there's no more Soviet Union. That was so
you would think
weird.
You would think if the United States was all of a sudden just going to be like, okay, we're just going to separate into whatever we're going to separate, you would like see it coming, but like it's just so out of the blue. Or like pick a random country, like all of a sudden Canada decides it's going to be like two countries. Like I wouldn't see that coming. It's like, hey,
Yep, that's very true. So that all goes down, and that whole collapse of the Soviet Union is bad news for CSKA Moscow, the Red Army team, because we said they had already been losing all their best players to the NHL, and primarily to the Red Wings. Well, they quickly go broke because the new government has little interest in funding hockey teams, and because their star players have all gone to the NHL, there's really no draw in terms of talent. Their fans are dealing with a host of other problems, like their whole country being, in chaos, as we'll get into. And they're not really coming out to watch the Red Army team anymore. So they're not getting the attendance numbers anymore. They don't have the star players. They don't have the backing of the government. And the Red Army team is basically on the verge of extinction at this point in the early 90s. The Penguins, meanwhile, are at the opposite end of the spectrum. They had just won 2 Stanley Cups. And in 1993, the team was 25 years old at this point. They had finally reached the pinnacle in terms of success and popularity in Pittsburgh. I mean, the Penguins were always third behind the Steelers and Pirates, always. And at this time, I don't think that was true anymore. And I don't think it's been true since. The team had recently been sold to Howard Baldwin. He bought the team from Eddie DeBartolo in 1991. And we did a whole episode called The Goal That Saved the Pens. And in that episode, we talked a lot about who Howard Baldwin was. So go back and listen to that if you get a chance, because that's another interesting Penguin story. But we'll just do kind of a quick recap here. Baldwin was a movie producer. He's a guy that lived in the Hollywood Hills. His next door neighbor was Madonna. So he was, kind of a celebrity, kind of mover and shaker. Baldwin is a dreamer. He's always thinking big. And he's also a huge hockey fan. Loves hockey. He had owned some minor league teams. And his entrepreneurial strategy was buying with very little of his own money invested. We talked in that Goal That Saved the Pens episode about how he paid $1,000 for the Penguins, literally $1,000 cash, and the rest of it was assumed debt and capital. Ultimately, Baldwin makes some terrible financial decisions that almost completely obliterate the franchise, the deal he makes with SMG, the arena managers, the huge contracts he handed out without the revenue to support it. Again, we covered all that in that previous episode. But here in 1993, Baldwin's riding high off the success of back-to-back championships, and he's looking for a way to keep that going. Baldwin, like we said, he's a dreamer. He's always looking for an opportunity, and he sees one here to buy the Red Army team, who's struggling financially. And Baldwin really sees 2 potential benefits. So benefit number 1, from a hockey perspective, wow, what if we could own the Red Army team and we'll literally have a pipeline right into the middle of Moscow, right? Because there's all these good Russian hockey players coming over, and we'll be able to mine them via the ownership of this team. We talked in previous episodes, Steve, about Bill Nunn and the Steelers in the 70s, how they had that pipeline into the historically black colleges that no one else had. I think maybe the Penguins thought they could have the same thing with Russia.
It's an interesting theory.
Yeah. I mean,
I can see like there's going to be problems with this, but yeah.
But you can see the thought process, right?
Yeah.
So the benefit number 2 was being on the ground floor of investing in this new country and its economy. You figure you had this big powerhouse nation. I mean, it was a large country, and it was kind of like almost like a capitalism free agent, right? Because now the doors were open. Vice President Al Gore makes a speech where he tells American businesses to take the risk and says, quote, "We are behind you as an administration." And a lot of American companies are doing just that. They're setting up shop in Russia, and they needed a mechanism to advertise. And Baldwin figures, hey, what better way to advertise than with this really popular, legendary hockey team? And many of the companies that were kind of setting up in shop in Russia were traditionally ones that advertise in American sports, like beer companies and shoe companies and fast food restaurants. And so, Steve, you said like you can kind of see it. I mean, I think Howard Baldwin's a guy that is not well remembered in Pittsburgh. I think the more we talk about him on the show, the more I can kind of see where he was coming from with a lot of his ideas. It was more about the execution maybe of those ideas, but I don't know. I can see it.
I can see the problem being like, is number 1, since the Soviet Union is now 15 separate countries, you're not going to just get like the best of the best being just shipped right to Moscow. And that's probably going to be the problem, is like, if you're just going to be one team in like a hockey league, you're not going to get the best of the best. You know what I mean? So, and this is long before the KHL. So I don't think the KHL existed yet. So, yeah, that's probably like two big problems. Is the whole goal is to get the top talent out of Russia by having this minor league team to draw them to, but without the Soviet Red Army to just go out and collect up all the talent and make them come there, I don't know how that's exactly going to work. So,
well,
just me spitballing here.
let's talk about how it worked or didn't work. I think too. One other point I'll make about Baldwin, he loved hockey so much. I wonder if part of the motivation was also that he just didn't want to see this legendary hockey team go out of business, and he thought he could rescue it, right? So that might have been part of the motivation too. Baldwin gets some folks together, and he actually has a couple of partners, silent partners. Mario Lemieux is one of the silent partners, and actor Michael J. Fox is one of his partners in this venture. Michael J. Fox actually goes on Larry King Live to talk about this, and I'm going to play that clip now.
You were telling me you own a piece of the Russian hockey team?
Well, you can't really call it owning because it's the Russian government. But we basically stepped in and took over the financial interest of the Central Red Army hockey team in Moscow, in Russia.
And you called them what?
Well, they're called the Russian Penguins.
So that was Michael J. Fox talking about the investment that he had made with Baldwin. And you heard him say there that you really can't own it. So what happens is the Penguins and their Russian partners each own 50% of the team. At the time, the Russian law wouldn't let an American company own more than 50% of any Russian entity. Maybe that's still the same. I don't know. But that was the case at the time. So the max stake that the Penguins could have was 50%. And then Russia owned the other 50%.
I run into that problem all the time with my vodka company. That's right. Putin won't let me own more than 49.9. So, yeah.
That's tough.
This
50-50 split, or this kind of supposed 50-50 split, is actually going to be very key later in this story. The Russian 50% is basically owned by two guys. So Viktor Tikhonov, who we mentioned before, he's still the head coach at this point. And then Valery Gushin, who's the team's general manager. So really, Tikhonov and Gushin are responsible for the Russian 50%. Gushin is kind of a hardline Soviet like Tikhonov, but unlike Tikhonov, he's more interested in the business side of the team. And I'd say he's also a little bit more jovial than Tikhonov. Karen Baldwin, who was Howard Baldwin's partner in the movie production company and Baldwin's wife, she relays a story how she would meet with Gushin and she would ask what the Penguins could do to make the team better. And his answer was always Mercedes for Gushin. So I don't know if they ever delivered on that, but I just thought that was kind of funny that was always his answer.
That's one way to make Gushin's life a little better. I don't know if the hockey will be any improved, but
happy employees, happy company.
There you go.
Although again, he was part owner, not employee, but nevertheless, Baldwin hires a guy named Stephen Warshaw to be their marketing guy. So Stephen Warshaw is kind of this brash, energetic young guy, and he's like, "Yeah, sure, I'll go over there and kind of run the operations," and not really having any clue what he's walking into. And when he gets to the arena that the team plays in, which is ironically called the Ice Palace, he's surprised to find out that it's a dump. I mean, this arena that they played in, I mean, this is really the Russian equivalent of Yankee Stadium or Lambeau Field, because it houses the most legendary sports team in the country. And Warshaw finds that lots of stuff's broken, the lights aren't working, the plexiglass around the rink, you couldn't actually see through it because it was all scratched up. The team at this point is sharing jerseys because they don't have enough money to buy new ones. And then even, this is kind of weird, there's actually a nightclub underneath the arena. It's actually inside the arena called the Red Zone, where they had naked women dancing in cages.
What's this? Some sort of side business? What the heck?
Yeah,
man.
it's a little seedy.
I'm assuming they were doing this willingly, right? It wasn't like they let me out. I can't have any food or anything. I hope.
That's a great question that I probably don't want to answer. As for the marketing side, they found that the Russians really had no idea how to run a for-profit business. That team had always been funded by the Soviet government, and they were selling tickets for literally the U.S. equivalent of a nickel, because they don't really understand this concept of supply and demand. And I'm not saying that like mockingly or judgingly. I'm just saying that, I mean, if you think about it, if you never lived in a capitalist society where you're trying to buy and sell and make money and set prices and all that, how would you understand any of that, right?
I don't know. I guess you better pick up a copy of Wealth of Nations in a hurry there by Adam Smith. But hey, how long did we have to go before I could get a Wealth of Nations and Adam Smith reference in the podcast? Like 2 years.
That's impressive. Very impressive.
Yeah.
We'll have to have a link to that book now. The arena has luxury boxes, but they're either being used for storage or they're being rented out for like little apartments for people to live in.
What Kanye West writing his new album in there or something back in 1991.
I mean, literally, this is all, and again, the Penguins are not, they did not know what they were getting into, and they were surprised at all of this stuff. The other thing that they were surprised at, the team doesn't have like anything celebrating their history. I mean, this is a team that won 13 straight championships, and you think you'd have posters and banners and everything else. There was nothing. Warshaw says the only thing they had, and they show a picture of it in the documentary, was this little trophy case that was about the size of a vending machine in the lobby, and it's next to like a bunch of plants. So like it doesn't even stick out. So Warsaw's walking into a mess with the hockey team. A much bigger mess is unfolding in the country itself. I think it would be easy to think that once a country is liberated from a kind of an oppressive system like that it would flourish. Like all these years of harsh communism, and now people are free to innovate and they're free to create businesses and create art and capitalize on their ideas like they never could before. But in reality, that's not really how it works. People are struggling to adapt. And then you have opportunists like the Russian mafia filling some of that void. And I don't know, Steve, it kind of makes
putting people in the basement in cages. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it makes me think of like the Shawshank Redemption. Remember like the old guy that they paroled from jail? I think his name was Brooks in the movie. And everybody's like, oh yeah, congratulations, you're getting out of jail. It must be so nice to finally have freedom again. But he like can't handle it. He like wants to go back to prison because he can't handle this new life and this new freedom. He was just so used to that system, even though it was harsh. And I just wonder, maybe for some of the citizens back then, if it was a similar thing.
No, I was just saying that's an apt comparison, because it's almost like they were institutionalized, which I think is the word that, the phrase that was used in Shawshank. But yeah, it's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, institutionalized. Yeah. I mean, and if it's all you knew your whole life, then it's hard to know anything different. It doesn't help too that the new government is not functioning at a high level. President Boris Yeltsin disbands parliament. The parliament fights back, and there's all this street violence that nearly results in a civil war. The core society systems are in chaos at this point. The healthcare system is a mess. The food distribution system is a mess. They show clips in this documentary of people at the supermarket sniffing the meat before they buy it, because sometimes it was fresh and sometimes it wasn't. Like there's no FDA or anything at this point. The law enforcement was pretty shoddy. There's really not a lot of rules. It's kind of a third world country, kind of a Wild West at this point. So Warshaw gets to work on marketing this new team. And I think, as you heard Michael J. Fox say in that clip, they rebrand the team as the Russian Penguins. And they come up with this logo. It's very similar to the Penguins logo. It's a little more three-dimensional. It's this penguin kind of like skating at you with a hockey stick, wearing this Siska Moscow sweater. They make the game night experience very similar to what you would see in an NHL arena with lights and music and stuff. They have a mascot who's basically like a carbon copy of Iceberg, and this stuff that is it's very countercultural because remember this is the Red Army team. You didn't have like QT animal logos and dancing mascots in the Soviet Red Army, and even just there were customs that were very different from here. One example is that it was considered impolite to cheer if your team scored a goal.
Wow. Well, I guess if you're like, one of those teams that doesn't score a lot of goals, you're a pretty polite person then. I guess. Yeah. Wow. That's an interesting cultural difference there. Yeah.
Right.
So like what they like taunting, like it was almost like you would like taunt the other team just because you were celebrating.
Yeah, I guess you're
that's
like in your face, goaltender, you just gave up a goal. Yeah, very different.
There had to be more context to that than just, yay, we scored, because there's difference between like, yes, we scored, then, haha, you stink, Tom Barrasso, or I don't know.
Yeah, I that would be an interesting one to delve into, but apparently that was the case. So again, they're trying to go against the grain in a lot of this stuff, and not surprisingly, it doesn't start well. The opening night game in the fall of 1993 draws virtually no one. But Warshaw, again, he's featured a lot in this documentary. So again, go check that out because he's an interesting dude. And he commits to filling the arena by Christmas. And he starts doing all these crazy stunts. So one night, the two teams line up for the opening face-off, but there's no puck. And a female acrobat dressed in a Russian Penguins uniform rappels down from the rafters, skates a lap around the rink, and then gives the puck to the referee. He has the women from the downstairs nightclub start stripping on the ice between periods. They actually follow the Zamboni around and just remove layers of clothes as they go. Wow. So that's a interesting thing to see.
Somebody's going to get cold.
Yeah.
Cold in a hurry.
Yeah. Warshaw he has free beer nights where they hand out Iron City. Of course, it has to be Iron City to everyone in attendance, regardless of age. So you had 14-year-old kids getting drunk. He has fan contests. He has like Gorbachev lookalike contests and bikini contests and stuff like that. So it's definitely a bit of a.
Is a Gorbachev in a bikini? Would you win both at the same?
Oh boy, I don't know that I wanted to see that if that was the winner, but it's wild. It's a freak show, but it actually does start to catch on, and it really catches on with the younger fans in Moscow, which you can see that, right? Because the older fans that were the institutionalized crowd, like that word you use, Steve, they're probably not going to go for this, but the younger people who maybe are more into Western culture and more into, crazy stuff that they've never seen before. They're the ones coming to the games, and they've never seen anything like this because hockey's always been militaristic, very businesslike, and the idea that could also be fun was new and it was exciting, and that's exactly what the Penguins have, come in here and created in Russia. And the Pens are also doing stuff that's not so crazy and even a little bit smart. So they're selling merchandise in the corridors of the arena, which again, you wouldn't think twice of over here, but nobody was doing that. They were selling advertising everywhere. The boards just used to be white boards. They were blank. So they're selling advertising on the boards, again, similar to what you would see over here, but they're also selling advertising on the jerseys, on the uniforms of the concession guys, and even the arena security guards have like a little McDonald's patch on them or whatever. They're
talking now, and they do pretty much all that. The uniform is pretty much, especially international. Although the NHL is starting to catch up, you'll see company logos all over. Even in soccer, like the company logo is bigger than the team crest. So maybe they're just ahead of their time.
Yeah, I think they were because, like you said, that all became a thing eventually. They're doing giveaways too, which again, like you have that over here, but they're not giving away bobbleheads and things like that. They're giving away things that are relatively inexpensive, like chocolates and razors. But those are things that a lot of people in Moscow at the time did not have easy access to. There were a lot of supply chain issues. There was a lot of chaos going on. They said even the toilet paper in the bathrooms at the arena was a valuable commodity. When they actually had to have a person at the entrance to the bathrooms who would hand out toilet paper to you before you went in. Because if they just put it on rolls in the stalls, people would steal it and take it home because it was something that they didn't necessarily have. So you could give away things like that, and people would come just to get a free razor or a free box of chocolates because that was not something you could go to the store and buy. And if you could get that stuff over there from Pittsburgh, it wasn't that expensive, and you could get a lot of people to come. So this all leads to success. The attendance is up. Warshaw had committed to selling out the arena by Christmas. He actually accomplishes that by November. And he starts finding more ways to make revenue. We mentioned the advertising. The games are also broadcast on national television. And traditionally in the Soviet Union, and even in this new Russia, you had to pay the TV station to carry your games. But here, the TV network is not only paying the Russian Penguins to put their games on TV, they're also giving them control over the sponsorships. They're giving them control over who was interviewed during the intermission and key aspects of the broadcast. So now the Penguins are managing all of that, which is all to their advantage financially. Al Gore even attends a game, and he makes a speech about how attendance is up 400% and what a great success story it is. And I don't know why Al Gore was so involved in Russia at this time. I'm not sure how he found time to do all that while he was creating the internet, but good on that guy for multitasking.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't an inconvenient truth that Russian hockey was awesome.
Poor Al Gore. So a lot of success financially right off the bat. On the ice, though, it's not a very good team. For years, that Red Army team was used to having all the top players, how we talked about, they could just get anybody that came into the Army. But now the best hockey players are in North America playing in the NHL, and the Red Army team doesn't have that pipeline like they used to have. Probably the best player on that team is the goaltender, a guy named Nikolai Hobby-Bolin, who later goes on to win a Stanley Cup for the Tampa Bay Lightning. He was a pretty good goaltender. But there's really no other real good players. In February of '94, they toured North America playing against minor pro hockey teams in the old International League, starting with an exhibition in Pittsburgh against the Penguins Farm Club, the Cleveland Lumberjacks. You remember them, Steve?
Sure. Yeah. Not at all. Not even a little bit. Yeah.
So there
wasn't there the Skipjacks? Wasn't there? I thought there was a Skipjack or something. Maybe it was the Pirates. I don't know. I digressed. Yes.
Yeah. Regardless, those teams weren't very memorable, and that's who they're playing this tournament against. And they don't fare very well. I mean, it's a good thing financially for the Pittsburgh Penguins because they're able to host one of the games. They're selling tickets. They're selling merchandise with this like USA versus Russia theme, which still had a lot of meaning to Americans. But for the actual team and their players, it's not good because the Russian Penguins players are smaller. They're not as skilled as the IHL players, and they go 2-9-2 on that tour. And they also get beat up a lot by these minor league North American players. Some of them had lost their NHL jobs to Russians, and they kind of saw this as like some kind of chance for revenge, which is kind of unfortunate. So this is all super frustrating for Tikhonov, the coach. He had been used to this military style discipline, and he had been used to dominating in these international games. And here he is managing young kids who aren't very good. He's coaching an organization who has strippers come out between periods, right? So you can just imagine this old line Soviet hockey coach just trying to deal with this kind of change, and it's not going to go well.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, you think of it like, I think as I get older, I understand like how hard it is to adapt to change, especially like this Tikhonov was very successful, it wasn't like he just like, oh, we kind of were okay or not very good. He like had one of the greatest hockey teams of all time. And now he's like, managing some minor league team that can't even compete with, minor league players. So, and it's all different. He just can't, he probably didn't, he probably had to do some scouting, but, he could just pick somebody and say, hey, I want, that guy. Whereas now he's going to have to compete for the players. So I'm sure it just was a lot of change, and adapting to, that much change just might have been just too much for Mr. Tikhonov there, but or Colonel Tikhonov, I guess if he still had his rank in the military there. But
yeah, very, very different world for him. But
maybe we could have called Herb Brooks for help, but maybe not.
It's full steam ahead though for the Penguins. They still see this as a huge opportunity. And around this time, Baldwin and Warshaw have dinner with a guy named Michael Eisner. And Michael Eisner was the CEO of the Walt Disney Company. And I think people our age, Steve, probably remember Michael Eisner because we were always into Disney as kids, and he used to show up on a lot of the Disney specials and stuff. I mean, he was the head of Disney for a while, I think. Very powerful.
He kind of saved Disney. Yeah, he saved Disney after Roy. Is it Walt Disney's brother? They kind of slipped, and then he kind of brought him back to, like, I don't know, success, financial success at least. I mean, if you consider The Little Mermaid a cinematic success, I guess. Yeah, it's a fun film. People like it. But I don't know if it's going to win any Oscars. But yeah.
Well, they definitely, by the 90s, they were a powerhouse company again. And you're right. I think that had slipped for a while. So Baldwin and Warshaw have dinner with Michael Eisner, and Disney is talking about investing heavily in this Russian Penguin thing. They allegedly even have their Imagineering department come up with new logo designs, and they talk about all this opportunity for tie-ins. Disney had these movies called The Mighty Ducks about this like kids hockey team. A lot of people remember those movies. And Disney's even talking about, one of the sequels could be like the American team versus the Russian team, stuff like that. Now, for the record, Disney denies ever being involved in any of this. It's the Penguins say no, they were like on the verge of like, pumping all kinds of money in, and they had all these ideas and there are all these plans. Disney says that never happened. So you can pick who you want to believe there. I mean, maybe Disney just owns like so much of the world that they forgot about this. Who knows? But anyway, definitely a lot of opportunity.
You just wonder, like, what Disney, like, if Disney just like tries to walk away, like there's like, nope, never had anything to do with it, can't prove it, or like, did the negotiations never get far enough where they put like a bunch of money into it? So they kind of have like that plausible deniability. Yeah, it happened, but Michael Eisner just heard about it and nobody really told him, So
maybe, yeah, it would be interesting to know what the real truth is there. Over the next few seasons, the team continues to make money, and they even start to improve on the ice. It kind of mirrors the success that the Pittsburgh Penguins were having at the time. So the future is looking bright for this partnership. However, things do start to go south a little bit. The Russian ownership starts to really clash with the Pittsburgh ownership. Tikhonov cannot stand all the marketing stuff. One thing he's particularly upset about is a promotion of one of the team's players, a guy named Alexander Kharlamov. And I think the one thing that everybody agreed on, the Pittsburgh side, the Russian side, everybody agreed that Kharlamov wasn't a very good player at all. Just not a very good hockey player. However, his father was a guy that Steve mentioned earlier, Valery Kharlamov, who's in the Hockey Hall of Fame and who's a Russian legend. And I mean, if you go look up Valery Kharlamov on YouTube. There's a 1978 game where CSKA Moscow was playing against the New York Rangers, and Kharlamov scores this goal where he splits like 4 Rangers and beats the goaltender. So again, his dad was a legend. And so since his dad was a legend in Russia, the Penguins thought it made financial sense to kind of promote him as the face of the team, to have him do interviews between periods, stuff like that. Well, Tikhonov, as this hardline old school coach, Tikhonov says, this guy hasn't done anything of note as a player. You should have to, earn your way to that kind of status. And so Tikhonov feels like his ability to coach the team and run the team is being undermined by the Pens. And I don't know, Steve, I can kind of see that, right?
I think he has a point. Like, you can see like how things would be done differently nowadays. Like, you would definitely have like if I was trying to do this again, like now, like I would have the local people more run it, because they would be more in tune with, okay, Varlamov, or I think I called him Varlamov, but would be a nice story, but you wouldn't make him the face of the franchise. You know what I mean? You'd be like, oh, here he is, and that was probably they overhyped him is probably what had kind of happened in his case. And I think Tikhonov has a great point. Like, you have to earn it, and just it's gonna like sell out kind of your credibility with the fans if you say, oh, it's like, remember Sammy Khalifa for the Pirates, shortstop of the future? It's kind of like that again. When you say somebody, oh, this is going to be the next great one, and they're not. Yeah, you kind of hope everybody forgets what you said, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's the best you can hope for in that situation.
Yeah. Valery Gushin, the general manager, who also owns part of that Russian 50%, the Penguins say he's stealing money from them. Gushin says all Americans are untrustworthy. So that's not a good setup. The Penguins send people over to Moscow, and they get reamed up by the Minister of Defense, who says, make no mistake, this is still the Army's team, which, really wasn't, but the Minister of Defense thought so. Warshaw also tells a story about how Nike was paying them $100,000 for advertising. So they set up a deal with Nike to put all these advertisements on the arena for $100,000. And the Russian management tore down all the Nike signs and replaced them with Adidas signs. And when Warshaw went to Gushin and said, why would you do this? Nike's paying us $100,000 to advertise. Why would you tear down all their signs? Gushin reportedly said, because it's our bleeping team. So that's not good. The Penguins also set up a deal with Procter & Gamble to have Tikhonov endorse Vicks cough drops. Get it? Victor Tikhonov for Vicks cough drops. And Tikhonov is less than thrilled about this arrangement, and he locks himself in his office the day of the commercial shoot. He does eventually do the commercial. I think you can find that on YouTube too. It's pretty awkward. Again, Soviet colonel popping like a cough drop.
Was this in Russia or in the United States? Like what would he even do? Hey, you remember me? I was the guy that was the evil Russian coach that your 1980 team beat. Here's some Vicks cough drops. Like,
no, this is all in Russia, because remember, Al Gore and the Clinton administration.
He's a legend. Yeah.
The Clinton administration is telling American companies go invest, and American companies are. I mean, Procter and Gamble. I mean, you needed products like that in this new Russia, right? People needed cough drops, and they don't know Vicks cough drops. But if Victor Tikhonov is popping Vicks cough drops, you'll know Vicks cough drops. And the Penguins think they can make a lot of money off of this. And again, Tikhonov not happy. Warshaw also says that they have a guy from the Russian mafia like sitting in his office spying on him. That's a claim that Gushin denies. So basically the Penguins think the Russians aren't being good partners. The Russians see it differently. They think the Penguins are making all this money off of the Red Army team, and they're cheating them out of their fair share. So there's definitely a lot of clash between the American and the Russian partnership. And eventually things start to get even worse. And I'd say, Steve, if you're running a business like this in a stable country, you could work through some of the management differences. You could bring in some consultants you could work through the differences. But here, that's really not the case, because the system in Russia itself continues to deteriorate. A lot is controlled by the mafia, and capitalism in its Western form really has a tough time succeeding here. And that's no different at the Ice Palace. There's always lots of mafia guys around wanting money for different things, and you had to pay them or else, right? Like, what are you going to do if they like, yeah, we need $100 for security tonight to provide security. Like, what? No, we have security guards. We don't. I mean, what are you going to say? Like, so.
Well, it would be a shame if something bad happened.
And things are starting to get legitimately dangerous. Warsaw is supposedly told that there's a hit on his life unless he quits the Penguins and works for the mob. The team photographer for the Russian Penguins is assassinated, allegedly because he took a picture of one of the mob bosses by accident. One of the assistant coaches is gunned down in the team parking lot, and one of the Russian Penguins players, one of their better players, guy had actually been drafted by the San Jose Sharks, is found dead under mysterious circumstances. So not only is there a clash with the management, but now people are literally dying. Disney pulls out if they were ever in, depending on who you believe. The pipeline of players, like Steve, you mentioned that didn't seem realistic in the first place. Well, it turns out to not be realistic. Yeah, I mean, you kind of called that one. It's not happening. They're just not getting the pipeline of players. You know, like you said, they're not just all in Moscow anymore, being drafted into the army. But you know, the other thing was that some of the other teams went to the commissioner, Gary Bettman of the NHL, and they're like, you know, we have a draft. These Penguins just can't, you know, have players play for their Russian team and then ship them over. It wasn't like a minor league team. So, you know, the Penguins aren't getting good players. And plus, like we said, there really weren't any good players for that team. Baldwin says the last straw comes when they have a year-end meeting with Gushchin and Tikhonov in 1995. They meet, I think it was in New York. It was in the States. And Gushchin and Tikhonov bring these two guys who are apparently very shady with them. And they introduce them as, quote, the new partners in the team. And the Penguins are like, what do you mean new partners? We don't even know who these guys are. We haven't vetted them or even met them. You can't just say that they're the new partners, right? So the next day, the Penguins decide they're just
the same guys that are taking the protection money. I guess they can. They made them an offer they couldn't refuse.
Probably. So the Penguins decide, you know what, we're done. They decide they're going to pull out of the investment. The team's going to be back to full Russian ownership, and the international joint venture experiment between the Penguins and CSKA Moscow is officially over. So let's talk about some of the aftermath of this. Boris Yeltsin resigns in 1999. He apologizes to the Russian people for, quote, not making many of your and my dreams come true. Yeltsin is replaced by a former KGB operative, a guy named Vladimir Putin, and the rest of that story is history. We won't get into that.
Putin's actually a big hockey fan. Like, did you ever see there's video of him on the internet playing, like literally playing hockey. It's true story. So
he is a big hockey fan.
I don't know if it does. Oh, CSKA. Okay. I was about to ask a question, but you're going to answer it yourself. Sorry, Tim.
Yeah. So Baldwin, meanwhile, eventually drives the Penguins all the way into the ground. The franchise declares bankruptcy in 1999 and is saved by Mario Lemieux and has a lot of successful years after that. CSKA Moscow is still around. They're not called the Penguins anymore, although they did keep that moniker for a few years afterwards. And they currently play in the KHL. And in fact, to kind of just bring this whole thing full circle, their head coach is Sergei Fedorov. So that franchise is still running. And yeah, it's just an interesting experiment. Definitely seemed like something that was going to work out for a while, but it was probably was kind of false hope because this thing probably never had a chance of working, Steve.
Yeah. What was it? 4 years? How long did this last? 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, 2 or 3, I think.
Yeah. It seems like the Russian way of doing capitalism is kind of like mob, or I mean, some people call it crony capitalism, where it's just you got to pay the mob to do business, or whoever's the strong man. So that seems to be more of the setup that will, and a lot of countries work like this. So that's probably was the bigger issue, and that the Howard Baldwin, who's from Hollywood, probably didn't really understand what was going on. And I would say that's probably one of the bigger issues is you have to understand who you're dealing with. And and obviously they were looking to keep their, their franchise afloat, Tikhonov and the Russian government without having to pay for it. And hey, got them through 2 or 3 lean years, and they're still in the KHL. Have they won any of their championships since, or I don't know? Is that CSKA Moscow?
Good question. But you're right. It probably ended up being a better deal for them than it was for the Pens, ultimately, because it did regenerate interest in the franchise, and it did get them through what was going to be bankruptcy, or whatever the Soviet or the Russian equivalent was at the time. So it probably worked out well for them. I think for the Pens, it was just something that they hoped would be a financial boom and would get them better on the ice here, and none of that happened. And then, of course, as we detailed in the previous episode that we did about the 1999 season and all that, I mean, it just all went to pot eventually anyway for the Pens.
Yeah, it's just, these international deals are probably tough to do between the, like you said, the culture and the governments and the, people like different things. So maybe hockey. I mean, hockey is popular in Russia. So, I mean, it would be fun, to see the KHL and the NHL, play each other at some point. Although, I guess most people will assume that, the NHL has much better players since they have more money. But, it would be interesting at least. I mean, because there's definitely talent over in Russia, and they always seem to have a lot of talent. It just seems that they come over here, more than they stay at home, but that's kind of how it works in international sports too, even in because the better is if soccer, that's people move around the better players always seem to move around even the better American players, is it Pasilic for he plays over in Europe, and he's one of the best, American soccer players, but he plays in the European, the English Premier League. So Howard Baldwin, he wasn't the greatest businessman in the world, and he definitely got in over his head with the Russian mafia and Viktor Tikhonov.
Sure. I think like you said, Steve, it was really about not understanding what you were getting into from a business perspective, and then trying to do all these things to make it work, but not realizing that the short-term success of some of those things were really not going to work with the culture and the partners you were working with. So I don't know. Like you said, Baldwin was a dreamer. Baldwin was let's make movies and let's do grand things. And a lot of times those things didn't work out, and it didn't work out here. It didn't work out eventually with his ownership of the Penguins, but definitely an interesting story, and one that I didn't know much about, Steve. And I thought it was very cool that somebody made a documentary about that, and that story gets to be told. So hopefully everybody enjoyed that. Thank you so much for listening. Please share the podcast with your friends. Word of mouth is definitely our best advertising. And check us out on the web, on Twitter, and on Facebook. See you next time.
Sammy!